Hello and good afternoon from Brussels. I am Olivier Mater. I'm the head of the international cooperation at the European Data Protection Supervisor. It's my pleasure to welcome you to EDPS Talks. This is an exclusive series produced by the EDPS as part of its initiatives to celebrate the institution's 20th anniversary. The talks aim at gathering leading voices from all around the world to share their unique perspectives on data protection and privacy. In today's talk, we will explore the global aspect of the discussion and hear from a non-European leading voice. It is an honor to discuss these topics with our guest, Dr. Towela Nyirenda Jere, joining us remotely from South Africa. Dr. Towela Nyirenda Jere is a head of the Infrastructure, Digitalisation and Energy Division at the African Union Development Agency, AUDA, NEPAD. This division is spearheading programs that advance regional integration in line with the aspirations of the African Union's Agenda 2063. Towela is an electrical engineer and development practitioner with more than 20 years of experience working in the private sector, academia, and international development. She is leading teams that are focused on infrastructure development, energy, digitalization, and cybersecurity. So basically, a portfolio that is way broader than only data protection, and I think this is of great interest to our listeners. So thank you very much, Towela, for joining us today, and welcome to these talks.
Thank you.
So, to kick off the discussion, we usually start the talk with our guest with an intimate, private question. I would say a very simple but a very fundamental one. What does privacy mean to you?
Hmm. So I think privacy for me really speaks to the ability for me to retain the right in terms of the data and information that is personal to me and how that is shared, how it is accessed, how it is used, by whom, and really being able to also, I think, retain that control in terms of who is my data being shared with, in what form, but also being able to have the right to take away that privilege if I feel that maybe my rights are being abused. And I think that it's always important, perhaps, given the times that we're living in, to have this understanding that my privacy online should really be the same as my privacy offline. So whatever privacy that I want to have in the offline world, I should also be able to enjoy the same kind of privacy when I am online. And sometimes it's a bit of a fine line. I think we tend to think and believe that in the online spaces, perhaps we don't manage our privacy the same way we do in the physical world. But I think it's always important to have that understanding that privacy is privacy, regardless of whether I'm offline or online.
Thank you very much for reminding also this importance of aligning the online and the offline world. And now, perhaps going to your role, and as someone deeply engaged in policies within the context of economic integration and the infrastructure and services sector across Africa, your work touches upon various aspects of the regulation of our digital society. So, can you tell us a bit more about your role at the African Union Development Agency, NAPAD, and highlight also, if possible, a few specific developments or challenges that you have witnessed and that are part of the evolution of African digital societies?
Mm. So, as the development agency of the African Union, AID and EPAD's mandate really is to advance Africa's aspirations in line with Agenda 2063. And as you're aware, that agenda really speaks to creating the Africa that we want by 2063, and looking at a number of areas and issues that we need to address as we look towards those aspirations. The issues around the digital economy and digital society, digital transformation are also paramount in terms of those aspirations. And of course, we see that with the way the world is going, the separation, I think, of digitalization and digital transformation from other sectors, I think, is becoming less is significant in the sense that digitalization, I think, has become embedded in just about everything that we do. So from the AU's perspective, I think the aspirations are really to see how do we better integrate digitalization and digital aspects into our societies. How do we leverage digital technologies? How do we ensure that Africa as a continent is able to keep up with the global developments in terms of the usage of these different transformative technologies? But I think also really paying attention to the fact that we have to be able to use these technologies in ways that are relevant and appropriate to our situation, but also to the needs of our people. So when we look at some of the major developments, I mean, of course, we see a lot of investments that are being made in infrastructure. And this is infrastructure both in terms of the terrestrial infrastructure, but at the same time, I think we've seen a lot of investments in the mobile sector and the mobile technologies, because those perhaps have been technologies that have been much easier perhaps to integrate seamlessly into people's lives. And I think what we've seen is that Africa has really been able to leverage mobile technology to the extent that we have significant levels of access to mobile communication and mobile services. Not yet 100% affordable, I think, for everybody on the continent, but definitely the services are available. And we see that there's a lot of innovation that has happened around mobile technology. So the use of mobile money, the use of mobile technologies for different kinds of services, whether we're talking about, farming extension services, or whether we're talking about health services, whether we're talking about education, and even in the financial services sector. So I think that's one area, I think, where Africa perhaps has really made significant strides, has also, I think, demonstrated how one can take a base technology and really innovate around it to sort of solve some of the pressing challenges that the continent is facing. Challenges, of course, will continue to be there, continue to exist. The digital divide, which we've been talking about for the longest time, and which we always talk about, let's close the digital divide. I think with every iteration, we close the divide, and then something happens that perhaps causes us to experience maybe a widening of the divide all over again. But I think suffice to say that there's still a lot of work that has to be done in terms of digital literacy across the continent, in terms of making services affordable. So I think we have dealt with some of the challenges to a degree around access. We still have some last mile access issues, but I think a lot of work has to be put in terms of making the services affordable and making the services more localized to where people are and the specific challenges that people are facing in their communities.
Thank you very much for this overview. And now, if you allow me, I would like to zoom in a little bit at the national situation and focusing a bit more on data protection. So how would you describe the current environment of national data protection legislations in African countries? And in your view, what do you think would make the implementation and enforcement of data protection laws on the continent more effective?
So Africa has gone through a very interesting period, I think, over the last, I don't know, maybe I would say about 5 to 6 years, I think. And part of it, I think, has really been stimulated by, the global developments and the whole conversations around data and the increasing significance of data in terms of our daily work and lives. And we see also that I think with the coming in of the AU digital transformation strategy, which had a number of pillars in it, and data issues and data governance being one of those, I think there has been a renewed impetus in terms of really trying to have a more targeted approach and a targeted way of dealing with data issues. So the African Union developed the AU data policy framework, which is really meant to be an overarching framework that provides guidance to member states in terms of some of the different things that need to be paid attention to as we merge and move into this new economy where data becomes more important and more significant. So that data policy framework, as I said, is providing the umbrella and the container for different initiatives. And what we've seen is that countries more and more are now beginning to enact data protection legislation and the accompanying regulation as well. We're sitting currently with about almost 70% of the 55 member states in the AU actually having some form of data protection legislation or regulation, which is a good sign. What I think then perhaps is still needed is to really build the institutional capacities in terms of having the relevant data protection agencies and authorities, in terms of also equipping other agencies that need to have some kind of a role in terms of the data ecosystem, and really trying to see how do you build the capacities, how do you strengthen the institutions, and then tied to that is the fact that, of course, a continent of 55 countries that's aiming to be integrated, that's aiming to leverage integration through the content of free trade area and so on. The issues of cross-border data flows are also becoming an important aspect of the conversation, and really trying to understand then how do we harmonize across the different regions and countries on the continent.
Thank you very much for underlining this trend with more adoption of data protection frameworks in African jurisdictions, but also some of the challenges and areas of focus. Now, if you agree, I would like to go from the national level to the regional or continental level and look at the impact of the Malabo Convention, the recent entry into force of the African Union's Malabo Convention, dealing also with cybersecurity, with data protection, etc., is effective now from 8th of June 2023, and it marks undoubtedly a significant milestone. And how do you expect this convention, also given its broad scope, to influence some of the data protection related challenges in African countries?
So I mean, I think we first of all have to celebrate the fact that the Malabo Convention has finally entered into force. I think it's been a long journey from when the convention was finalized and developed, and to see now the fact that we actually have a convention that's been ratified. And I think that's something to celebrate. But even as we're celebrating, of course, we acknowledge the fact that there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of unpacking the provisions of the convention, in terms of looking at the specific things that member states now need to start paying attention to, but also what does this mean in the evolving context of the digital economy. One thing that is very clear, of course, is that the convention will have to find a way of really being a bit of a living document to some degree, because as things change, as things evolve, and considering that it's been a bit of time since we framed the convention to where we are now, there's a bit of stock taking that will have to happen again to sort of see which provisions of the convention do we now need to perhaps revisit. And I think member states have already expressed some of that in terms of where they see perhaps a need to go back and revisit some of the provisions, but at least it gives us the impetus to have this conversation, the fact that we now have the convention having entered into force. I think what we also then see is that because the convention is really talking about privacy, cybersecurity, and data protection, and covering all these three aspects, from the data protection side, there's a need to now look at what is in the convention and vis-a-vis what is in data policy frameworks, and then start to begin to see what does that mean in terms of the provisions of the convention, the institutional capacities that are needed, and how will countries begin to address that. We see that there will be a need for a lot more dialoguing, a lot more discussions, a lot more contextualization also. In terms of the convention and what it means. Previously, when we were still working on trying to get the convention ratified, as AUD and EPAD, we had taken a view of really trying to help countries to understand how far they were from meeting the provisions of the convention, as a way of motivating that discussion and that understanding of the convention, and sort of doing these assessments that sort of told countries, well, this is what the convention says, this is what you have, and this is sort of what we need to do to bridge the gap between where you are and what the convention is asking for. So again, these things we will need to continue doing, and alongside that, we will need to have the conversations around what else do we need to have in the convention as we move forward. So for me, it's a very interesting time, because I think there's a lot of energy around the conversations on cybersecurity, on data protection, on data governance, artificial intelligence. So it really is a good time to be really having these conversations, and maybe trying to then see how do we have a bit more of a forward-looking approach, as we start to unpack the provisions of the convention and its implementation.
Thank you very much, and I'm sure we'll all follow with great interest all the developments in relation to this convention. Now, I would like to move from the continental level to the more international aspect of this discussion. And in the past, we have often seen the so-called Brussels effect that was mentioned also sometimes in relation to the GDPR having an impact on legislation around the world. And in your perspective, in what aspects are you seeing some European influence? In what aspects are you seeing, at the contrary, some, I would say, pushback to European influence, and rather the development of a regional or national flavor to regulating, in particular, personal data? And perhaps also an additional question: do you see a need for more dialogue, for more cooperation at a more global level, and in particular between the EU and Africa on digital regulation questions?
Mm. So I think maybe I will start by maybe prefacing my comments by really appreciating the relationship that exists between the AU and the EU. And I think, as you're well aware, I think the AU and EU have a long history of cooperation, and this is framed in terms of the joint AU-EU strategy. And there's a number of different sectorial imperatives and sectorial initiatives that are looking at this cooperation. And in the space of digitalization, that is also very evident in terms of the various initiatives that are jointly implemented between the AU and EU. So I think against that backdrop, I think there is that appreciation in terms of what Africa can learn from the EU. But I think there's always also the other side of it, of what can the EU also learn from Africa. So when we look at the GDPR, I think the GDPR set standards in terms of how countries could actually approach data protection. And the interesting thing there is that, of course, this was done at the level of a union. So, with all the member states basically agreeing and adhering to this way of dealing with data protection. When you look at the Africa side, I think, mirroring sort of the approach of getting some broad consensus, I think that has happened through the data policy framework. I think where we differ, of course, is the fact that on the AU side, perhaps these are not binding directives. So it is mostly left now to member states in terms of how they domesticate and how they appropriate and use the continental framework. So that's one area perhaps where we will see a difference in terms of the approaches. But I think that we cannot escape the fact that it's always useful for us to learn from those that have gone before us, and to sort of see what is working, what's not working, and how do we then do things that perhaps we can also contextualize and make work within our context. Having said that, I think that because the level of maturity perhaps of the digital ecosystem on the continent is not at par with that of the EU, that there's still a lot of things that we still have to do, still a lot of work that has to be done with the member states in terms of the national ecosystems, that it will take us a while to reach the level of enforcement, compliance, and being able to sort of operate at the level of the GDPR. But definitely we can see, of course, that the provision of the GDPR, the enforcement mechanisms, all of that, we see it, we experience it, because obviously we also access services that are either provided in EU member states or through entities that have to adhere to the GDPR. So we're well aware of it and we see it. And then I think the question is, how do we use the same kinds of mechanisms, but use them in a way that speaks to our context, because maybe we may not have the necessary capacity to deal with the regulatory overheads and the compliance issues that are relevant. So I think we will continue to learn, and we will continue to adjust and to adapt and to take things at pace in line with where we are. So I think the Brussels effect, definitely we see that in terms of just the learning, from what's happening outside of ourselves, learning from the EU, and just really trying to sort of see how we adjust and adapt. Now, as far as pushback is concerned, I think there perhaps pushback might manifest itself in terms of the capacity constraints. It might manifest in terms of the fact that it may be very difficult for us to really implement very onerous compliance regimes, because maybe we just don't have the capacity to deal with that. So we may have to sort of see how we take the general spirit of the provisions, but contextualize them in a way that we can actually deal with them in our context as well.
Thank you very much for these insights. I think it's a lot of food for thought. Now, I would like also to ask you a last question in relation to the future, so a forward-looking question. So, if you consider the next 20 years, how do you envision the evolution of society and data protection, in particular, in African consolidated democracies, and as well as in those countries where the process of democratization is ongoing?
Mm. Mm. Well, I mean, let's agree first of all that the next 20 years, I think, will be very interesting from the continent's perspective. So maybe just to put that in more context, so we have just finished the first 10-year implementation plan of Agenda 2063, which is Africa's 50-year plan from 2013 to 2063. So we finished the first 10-year, and we have designed and developed the second 10-year implementation plan. So in 20 years' time, we'll have gone through 3 cycles of these 10-year plans. And hopefully we will have gotten better in terms of the implementation and also getting closer to the ideal of the Africa we want. What I think has been seen and learned from the first 10-year implementation plan has been, of course, which is what you are alluding to a little bit in your question, is that countries are different. Countries are moving at different paces. There's a lot of lag in certain areas, perhaps where there shouldn't be that lag. And so there's a need to sort of begin to see how do we make sure that by and large the continent is moving in lockstep towards these ideals. So the second 10-year implementation plan has been really conceptualized around a way of accelerating progress towards the development imperatives. And so obviously this will spill over into the digital ecosystem, and by transference then also into these issues around data. What is very interesting, I think, also with where we are now and in the age of AI and all things AI, is that there is that growing recognition of the importance of data, and how data then becomes a very central part of this evolution towards automation, towards AI, and so on. So we are seeing more and more a really significant move towards understanding the impact of AI, understanding the impact of data, trying to then understand what does that mean for our education systems, what does that mean for our other sectors, whether it's health, it's education, agriculture, and so on, and really trying to sort of really figure out then what do we need to be doing better insofar as integrating data, but also the governance of data into the different spheres of Africa's development. I think that in the next 20 years, the CFTA, which is now operational, will have matured to a degree where, again, building on infrastructure, which is the physical infrastructure, but also building on social infrastructure, building on digital infrastructure, that there will be perhaps more regional integration. But I think that there will also be more, I think, I won't say integration, but maybe in a way better integration of Africa within the global context, and really Africa perhaps finding its space more in the global context, and also finding its voice a little bit more. I think we are seeing that a little more now than maybe we did 10 years ago, where I think Africa is really in a space where we are better able to advocate for ourselves, better able to articulate our priorities and to stand by our priorities. And I see more and more of that. At the same time, I think in 20 years' time, the population dynamics will have shifted a lot, and we all know about Africa's demographic dividend. So hopefully by then we'll have started to see the benefits of that. I think we will also be seeing more of, with this generation that's coming up. I think they are less likely to see borders and boundaries than we are at the present time. So maybe that will also be an interesting time in terms of the free movement of people, goods and services across borders, and what that then also means in terms of the integration of all these different data systems, and then the harmonization of all these data systems that will facilitate this free movement of people, goods and services. So I think it's going to be an interesting time 20 years from now, and hopefully we will look back and look at where we are now and the conversations we're having now, and really wonder how did we manage, without all the things that will be existing in the next 20 years.
Thank you so much. I could not agree more, and that it will be a fascinating time. And but now I'm afraid we are reaching the end of our fascinating discussion. And let me first thank you very much, Towela. It was a real pleasure listening to your insights. I think it's a lot of food for thought. I think you shed light on so many aspects, from the development and challenges in Africa, African digital societies, to the state of play of data protection legislation in Africa, from the impact of the Malabo Convention to international cooperation opportunities, and to the challenges that lie ahead of us. So your intervention is also, to me, an important reminder that the challenges we are facing on digital regulation have to be approached globally, that we face common challenges, and that we also need common standards to address these challenges, and that I think we have a common interest to ensure the protection of our citizens, should they be based in Brussels, should they be based in Johannesburg, or should they be based elsewhere. Thank you also to our listeners for watching this episode of the EDPS 20 Talks series. As always, we invite you to follow our activities celebrating the EDPS 20th anniversary on our dedicated website and on social media. This episode will also soon be available as a podcast on Spotify, so stay tuned for the next episode.